Being recorded, councillors. Thank you. Councillors, the time is now 6 p.m. It's Tuesday the 13th of July 2021. I now declare the agenda briefing of the 13th of July open. We start, of course, by acknowledging the Whadjuk people, the traditional custodians of the land, and we also pay our respects to elders both past and present. Tonight's meeting is for the purpose of asking questions and seeking clarification on agenda items for the next ordinary council meeting. No decision-making or entering into of debate is to occur at this meeting. May I ask everyone present to please turn off electronic devices, mostly mobile phones, iPads and tablets, for the duration of the briefing as they interfere with our recording processes. Tonight's agenda briefing is being recorded. A copy of the audio recording shall be available on the City's website within 72 hours. Agenda briefings are public meetings and any information you provide may be publicly accessible. As far as disclosures of interest, the prescribed disclosure requirements apply to meetings that are convened under the provisions of the Local Government Act. However, it may be perceived as ethically unacceptable and at odds with the probity and accountability principle of the Act and Codes of Conduct for elected members to participate in forums, briefings or workshops where they are aware they have a conflict of interest and do not declare it. In the interests of openness and accountability, elected members are encouraged to disclose a conflict of interest where they are aware they have one when attending a forum, briefing or workshop, and where applicable, remove themselves from the room while the matter is being discussed. At item 2, attendances, Councillor Sweeney is absent, as is Councillor Porter, both absent at the moment. It doesn't matter that they're here, they're not at the meeting, so they are absent at the moment for the point of the recording. Approved leave of absence at item 2.2. There are no approved leaves of absence recorded. Disclosures of interest. CEO, can you please advise of any disclosures?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So we have a disclosure from Councillor Spencer-Teo in relation to EN 01221, and Councillor Spencer-Teo has declared an impartiality interest.
Thank you. Declarations of interest at 3.1, financial and impartiality. We've been through that. Question time for the public. At item 4.1, response to previous questions taken on notice. Responses to any previous questions taken on notice will be noted in the ordinary council meeting agenda. Questions from the public. The time set aside for public question time is 15 minutes, and that may be extended if necessary. A question tonight must relate to an item on the agenda paper. For recording purposes, if you intend to ask a question, you are to please state your name and address and then proceed to ask the question. If an answer cannot be provided at tonight's meeting, the question will be taken on notice and an answer will be provided at the next ordinary council meeting. In accordance with policy ADO2, members of the public who have registered their interest to ask questions shall be called upon in the order in which registrations were received. Have we got any registrations? We haven't. I open question time now. By my recollection, is 6:04 p.m. Do we have any questions from the floor? We've got a number of deputations coming up, so maybe we'll move straight to those. 6:04. I'll close public question time. There are no questions being asked. At item 4.3 at deputations, we do have a number of deputations tonight. We have them from Mr. Nicholas Temov, Mr. Dennis Loffel, Mr. Aniket Hivarakar, and also Mr. Howard Ong. I'll just make the point that I believe that each one of those delegations is about exactly the same subject matter. So I'm not sure whether you intended to conduct 4 separate deputations or to actually conduct those together. Thank you, Mr. Ong. First deputation is from Mr. Nicholas Temov regarding item CD 020 of 21, the adoption of local development plan for 31 Webb Street. Mr. Temov, would you please step forward? I'll just ask you to please state your address. You have up to 10 minutes, Mr. Temov, to make your deputation. Mr. Temov here? He's running late, is he? I'll move to Mr. Dennis Loffel. Dennis, are you in the room? Would you like to step forward, please? Step forward to the microphone. I believe the microphone is already on. I'll just ask you for the sake of the record to state your name and also your address. You have up to 10 minutes.
Yeah, my name's Dennis Loffel. I live at 24 Bull Creek Road, Rossmoyne. directly opposite the proposed development. There was a submission. I don't know if we're able to show that. Does
I
that
beg your
work?
pardon?
There was some slides that were submitted. Are we able to show that?
I'm not certain.
No?
Not in relation to this. I think some of the other speakers have asked for a presentation to be put on screen. That's already been prepared, but
Okay.
not for this presentation, I believe. But
All right, that's a bit awkward.
did you just on that? But did you actually send a presentation to
I
the
believe
staff?
I attached it to the website, yeah.
You attached it to the website.
In the submission when I lodged my deputation.
Are we able to check? I'll just ask. Just pause just for a moment. Are we able to check
Yeah,
whether or
thanks.
not that's been received? I might have to ask you just to proceed, and hopefully you're able to do so.
Yeah.
We don't have a record of that being received by us, and
Perhaps
I
could
apologise
email
for
it.
that if that's
Yeah.
occurred.
No, if it's my fault, I apologise for that. Perhaps I could just email and you could distribute it. The part of my thing is mainly about sight lines from that development, being in very close proximity to that development. The planning put in front of us is a 2D representation, which is fairly, it obscures the reality of the situation. If you consider each of those properties fronts up probably about 2 meters to the north by the time you get to the backyard, probably more in some cases. The other thing is that there's a longitudinal dip east to west. So when you just show a 2D sightline thing, basically it ignores the fact that from any one of those street fronting windows, you can see into all of our back lawns at about ankle level. So where the sight lines are showing that, sight triangles pass well above our gardens, that's not the reality. It also shows each of the properties being a double story, which there isn't a double story on that side of the street. And then obviously the tree screening is not really applicable. 2 of the councillors were kind enough to attend, and on our side of the street there's the odd tree on the other side. Well, maybe that mature vegetation will be installed, but I'd suggest that it's going to be relatively ineffective at the level that they're proposing. The other point I do raise is that there's a 4th story that's only a few meters back from the 3rd story. And I was informed that the plan currently in front of council shows those units facing southwards. If that is the case, that's brilliant. If they start facing northwards, or if there's balconies that extend on that side, then obviously that raises the whole sightline issue again. Yeah, basically that's my submission, that I really hope that council considers each of those sightline things in 3D geometry rather than just a 2D glorified town planning sketch.
Okay, thank you for
Thank
coming
you
down
very
this evening. Thank you. I have next Mr. Aniket Hiverika. I also have just a notation here that you do have an attachment that you wanted put on screen. So
correct.
Is that it there, Governance? That's what we have? Okay, please go ahead. You have up to 10 minutes. I'll get you just to state your name, please, and also your address.
Yep, my name is Aniket Hiverika, and the property address is 32 Bull Creek Road in Rossmoyne. So I share the same concerns that Dennis has raised, and so essentially what we would like to take into consideration is as part of the assessment phase, we would request the development and the council and the powers to be to sort of consider the line of sight into the backyards of the houses pretty much on all of the street. So the point that we're trying to sort of suggest is the individual blocks on the street essentially from the front of the house raise up to the back, and that probably needs to be considered as part of the assessment. We're not at this stage a bit clear on that. So we would like that to be considered. And the other part was From a traffic perspective, I believe there has been a assessment probably performed. We would like to just request that to be taking into consideration the aspect of the school peak times, and if that could be impacting or exacerbating a traffic issue in that area. So essentially, those were the 2 points that I wanted to raise as part of this deputation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have Mr. Howard Ong.
Thank you, Mayor. I just realized Gary is your representative here already. Does he want to go ahead first?
Mr. Ong, I've called you forward. If you don't mind, I'll get you to go ahead.
Okay,
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. First of all, thank you for the opportunities. I particularly is grateful for a couple of things besides being here. I'm very grateful particularly for Councillor Ben, Councillor Amanda for coming down and meet us last Sunday on Sunday afternoon to meet our residents to discuss our concern. I would also like to congratulate the city for initiating this to give us a bit of clarity on what the site development is going to look like in the forward years. I would also would like to congratulate Gary and his team. The LDP is very detailed and it gives us some clarity, and we appreciate that. In principle, the residents had a discussion, and we are in general agreeable on a number of things in broad terms. We are in general in supportive of that development. We feel that providing more aged care facilities in this aging population, giving this aging street a spruce of new buildings is actually a good thing. However, as in all cases, when we look at the details, we nevertheless harbor a number of concerns. And I'd like to take this opportunity to just highlight them. I also would like to thank Councillor Ben in particular. He sent me an email yesterday, explaining to me in quite detailed terms the time frame limitation that we got to work within, and I acknowledge the fact that some of these rules we are adhering to are not the councillor rules, and therefore certainly the council cannot be attributed to some of these limitation that we are working under. Notwithstanding that, the main concerns are two. The first one is with the concern of the privacy. We acknowledge and understand that the developer has gone to the extent of putting up trees and a verge to try and shield us for some of that. We were glad that the 4-story building at this stage, and I will appreciate Brosman Water confirming this later on in the deputation, whether that the plan is for it to face away from the residents, the private residents, and that is a great relief. However, what remains is that there is, notwithstanding that the development complies with our building rules, state law, what is in fact cannot be denied is that there is going to be a big building right in front, across the road in front of us. It is quite overbearing. It is quite overimposing, particularly the 3-story building, which is closer. As Dennis alerted a while ago, and can I get a little while ago, I think my document was shown up. There was a diagram in there. Can we just flick back there to that diagram if I can?
Mr. Ong, just give us a moment. We'll see if we can find it for you.
Just stop there for a moment.
Is that the one you're hoping for?
Yep, that's what I'm hoping for. Thank you so much, Mayor. So in that little illustration, there's a couple of things I'd like to point out in that illustration. The first thing is that the tree on the right-hand side, the northern side of the road, those trees are council verge trees. They are not meant for screening purposes, and they're certainly not at that height illustrated. So they don't, for all intended purpose, supply or satisfy a screening purposes. The 2-story allowable building superimposed the single-story building, in a way, is quite irrelevant in this discussion because currently all the residents on that street are single-story. Mr. Endicott is planning to build a house, and from what I know, he's also planning to build a single-story, which means that in the foreseeable future, it is single-story house on that side of the road. If we turn to the other side of the road and look at the line of sight from that 3-story building onto our backyard, what is not evident in that picture, in that diagram, is that the topology of the area is such that the slope upwards towards the north, which means that my backyard is higher than my front yard. In fact, my back boundary is probably something like 3 meters higher than my front boundary. So imagine if you guys are the 3-story building and I'm the little house in front of you. What it is that my backyard is tilted upwards, making it more visible. And therefore, our concern about this fairly overbearing building in front of us, that someone might be looking at us without even using a telescope, is basically centered on those points. I'll move on to traffic. Traffic in the area, again, I acknowledge and thankful to the council the fact that council has intend to build traffic improvement in the area. And that junction where Blue Creek Road meets Webb Street is very tricky. There is actually no easy way to resolve that issues. And the council has, for its credit, put up quite a good plan to try and improve upon that. I'm sure it will improve traffic in that area somewhat. It hasn't been built yet, of course. Notwithstanding that, I also acknowledge the fact that the developer did a detailed study of traffic in the area and concluded that the traffic added on is going to be quite minimal. Notwithstanding these, the fact is that during school peak hour, as Mr. Anika has pointed out, during school peak hour, the area is already over congested. If you ask any of the houses there, we can't get out to the road during those school peak hours. This is currently as it stands. By adding more traffic to the area, no matter how minimal, and noted is 85 residents, by adding whatever minimal traffic onto that is going to exacerbate the situation. While the council will improve the area, and quite frankly, after this particular project, I really can't see, I'm not a traffic expert of course, but I really can't see how it can be improved further. Which means that what we could be looking at is what the council helped improve in one hand, spending lots and lots of ratepayer money, could pretty much be balanced out and done or simply cancelled out by this new development. So what are we asking for? Quite little actually, because of the limitation. We certainly, as Councillor Dan pointed out to us, we certainly are not in the position for council to say give us more time. We would really like to consult the rest of the 9 councillors that we yet to meet and discuss this issue with. In the very short time we really have only 1 week before the vote. And I would say that my submission has my phone number. If you'd like to speak to the residents, contact through me. I'm not the spokesperson by any chance. I'm just a convenient contact. I certainly would like to facilitate that if you would like to. And one of the points we will raise is, again, I'm not architect, I'm not a building expert. If there's any way to mitigate these concerns, we'll be grateful. For example, if, again, I'm offering this as a very layman suggestion. If there's any way line A, which is the 2-story or 3-story setback, if that can even be lowered to 2-story to be consistent with the resident on the opposite side, that will in great way address our privacy concern, assuming that the 4-story is facing away from us. And that will also, depending on what Gary and his team decide to do with the rest of the development, that will also in some way alleviate some of that traffic concern if the yield is not that much. Look, I'm a businessman. I know that this thing needs to pay off, cost-benefit analysis. So I'm not sure that is feasible at all from a financial point of view. But just from a resident's point of view, these are something important to us that we wish the council and the developer, with our support, we consider in a very collaborative, cooperative neighborhood manner. That's the end of my deputation. I thank you for this.
Thanks, Howard. Nice to see you again. Thank you for coming along.
Thank you, Mayor Patrick.
And finally, I have Mr. Nicholas Timov. Would you like to come forward? I'll ask you please to state your name and also to state your address. And you have up to 10 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Thank you to the councillors and council staff for allowing us to have this deputation. My name is Nicholas Timov and I represent Aventus Care, the developer, the landowners of this site, and I work for Haim Charlie. We are on Hay Street in Perth. Yeah, great, thank you. So I have a few slides to go through just to give you a bit of an idea of how we've come up with the local development plan for Ross Moyne Waters and for the site, and all of the considerations that we have that we've pulled together as we've been developing up the LDP. There we go. And to start with a little bit of information about Aventus Care, the landowners of this site and developers of this site. What I want to point out here is Aventus Care have been a part of the community in Ross Moyne since 1963 and more than a typical developer. Aventus Care owns and manages the buildings and open spaces on this site and has proudly managed them from those historical times and will look to do so well into the future. And that means the quality of what we see with the development itself and the spaces in between, we think will work very well for the site. The other difference about Aventus Care and the quality that it looks to provide on this site is that it also looks to integrate services in and around the buildings themselves, so not simply providing apartments for development, but looking at all those wraparound services that local residents and the community can enjoy. We know that aged care and seniors housing is so important in established neighbourhoods, particularly as people's housing careers change and as they grow and need alternative accommodation requirements. And that's why we see the importance of development of this site being of benefit to all people who live in and around the neighbourhood. And just a few images to show what modern seniors aged care and seniors living looks like nowadays. We know that it's more than the buildings itself, it's the spaces around them, it's the activities that occur in these spaces. These aren't stock images, these are taken from the Aventus Care site itself, and this is the lifestyle and the quality that we're looking to produce on site. The future stages contemplated as part of this local development plan. We're looking at a range of different accommodation types to be included on site. Firstly, our seniors living apartments, which are effectively apartment buildings that comprise of residents with independent seniors living inside that have wraparound services for the community. We're looking at 2 stages there of 41 and 35 additional dwellings over the period of time. We've currently got 127. We are also noticing a change in the way aged care and assisted living works, and Aventus Care is working to adjust to these changes. That assisted living is a new hybrid type of accommodation that sits somewhere in between aged care and seniors living to provide bed sits that offer additional services to people who need them on their journey towards aged care itself. As part of the LDP, we've also contemplated a large communal open space that sits in the middle of the site for residents and the community to enjoy, and sorting out matters related to car parking and also car parking for caravans and also hobby workshop rooms as part of the LDP. So the local development plan looks like this, and I'm sure you've all had a look at it. This is the local development plan that was requested by the city, and really it helps us to coordinate development on site for larger complex sites. So what you'll notice in this is some diagrams and some text that helps us provide some guidance and some clarity and certainty for the community around how buildings can be arranged, height, setback, access to open space and landscape. The important thing to remember is it doesn't include detailed information on building design or construction, as this comes up later in the development application period. We've also been very mindful of local context and those considerations. We know that we've got a busy road that sits to the south, and we've also got southwesterly winds to consider and solar paths that sit to the north. So south of Bull Creek Road, we know that there are minimal impacts on shadows and solar access, but we're deliberately looking to step development down and the height of development down as it makes its way to Bull Creek Road, and we think that this is really important to relate the existing development back to the neighbourhood. The other thing that we're mindful of is our taller buildings and taller heights sitting further towards the busier road, and that allows for additional noise attenuation to occur for residents that live further to the north. With movement considerations, I have my colleague here, Matt Root, so we can answer detailed questions about movement if that's required. But we know that aged care and seniors living types of land uses have much lower rates of movements, particularly through peak periods, and that means that the impacts on peak period movements are very limited. We're very conscious of existing access onto the site. It is a large site, but we're very mindful that we can't achieve access off Leach Highway, and that we'd be using existing access points that are in the area and improving the safety of access of that access point that sits to the east. And we're also looking to formalise some of those crossovers, for instance, the one that sits further to the west, where we have some informal crossover points. We're looking to formalise those where caravan and boat parking would exist. The other very important consideration, we've been out on walks, we've really tried to understand the site and have been a part of this process even through the first Australia stage. We know that we have a very important neighbourhood edge that sits to the north of the site, and I just want to talk through the sorts of considerations that we've come up with, because we think that they will work very well for the neighbourhood and also improve the outlook onto the southern edge of Bull Creek Road. We're making a conscious decision in this LDP in the suggestion that we step development down, and those heights from 8 stories down to 3 stories to Bull Creek Road, and that's making sure that lower heights are considered towards the residential neighbours. We're also very mindful of existing suburban setbacks to make sure that there are garden spaces in between, and for that reason we've included a very clear and generous 4 metre landscape setback that opens out onto Bull Creek Road to make sure that we're getting landscape character and that's those suburban qualities existing on either side of the road. This section came up earlier on in your slides. However, I think it's important to reiterate that we are looking at quite a distance between the edge of what would be a proposed building on the Aventus Care site and where existing residents sit. Somewhere in the order approximately does change depending on where setbacks are on the northern side of the road, but about 30 metres. And that's a really important consideration to make sure that for privacy reasons and also for outlook purposes, that 30 metres is very important for the local community. I have also included in here just the development potential on the northern side of the road. We do understand that at the moment we do have traditional existing 1-storey developments on that side of the road. However, we do need to be mindful of future R-codes considerations, and at the moment, under current planning controls, residents can go up to 2 storeys on that side of the road. So what we're looking to do is step back our development by 4 metres and make sure that there is that space for green trees to grow. We'd be looking at balconies and courtyards that open onto the street, similar to the way porches work, and making sure that we're getting a living edge to that street. So it wouldn't be a blank wall or anything. You'd see some depth and some diversity in the front of that facade. And then making sure that we're stepping back again as we go back to our 4 metres.
You have 1 minute left. Thank you.
On visual privacy, I know that this is an important consideration for residents. We're making sure that visual privacy is considered all the way through, and the LDP at the moment exceeds the acceptable outcomes of State Planning Policy 7.3. We're looking at a distance to ensure that there is visual privacy of about 30 metres, and the state government's minimum requirements in that policy are sitting about 15. So we're looking at about double that distance to make sure that there is enough visual privacy for residents who exist on the northern side. And just that mature tree edge, this is the sort of edge that we're looking to promote. It's very generous and also is wide enough for large roots of trees to grow, so that we get a continuous edge that filters the space between buildings and the street. So it's offering shade, ecological connections, and also allowing for more people to get out onto their balconies and enjoy those trees.
Thanks, Mr. Timov.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming along. And just for the sake of all those people that are here for this item, I'm going to bring it forward in the agenda so we can deal with that next, and that way you don't have to sit here all night to wait for it to come up, even though it was relatively early in the piece anyway. Councillors, at item 5, items brought forward for the convenience of those in the public. I will bring forward tonight item CD 020 of 21. And that obviously is the adoption of local development plan for 31 Webb Street, Rossmoyne. So that'll come up shortly. At item 6, reports of committee meetings, there are none. And as far as reports at item 7, we will then move straight into CD 020 of 21. And I'll just catch up, it's on page... the recommendation, councillors, is on page 29 of the agenda this evening and is also on screen. Councillor Holland.
Mr Mayor, just for the sake of the recording, should we note that the two councillors are in the chamber now?
I think that'll be noted in the minutes.
For the,
yeah, I'm happy to do that. Yeah.
Audible.
Councillors Porter and Councillor Sweeney are absent at the beginning of the meeting and now present in the meeting and have been for some time. Thank you, Councillor Holland. Councillors, as I said, it's on page 29 of the agenda and is now on screen, the recommendation. Are there any questions from the floor? Councillor Barry.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just two questions. One, is this a rate exempt property?
Is it a what?
A rate exempt?
Director?
Sorry.
Microphone stood down at the top of the...
Yeah, through you, Mr Mayor, unless CEO Kane knows anything further, the site is a not-for-profit development and would normally not attract rates.
The gentleman in the back has put his hand up right now.
We'll take that on notice. The indication is that that they do pay rates. That's the indication from the gallery, so I won't dispute that. But CEO, can I ask that we could take that on notice and provide a response? Councillor Barry, a second question.
Yeah, just the last gentleman to speak. Just from the point of view of the privacy that seems to be probably one of the main concerns. Is there any, with the balconies, any balconies that will face north across those to the residential properties? Is there any privacy provisions, bar the distance, that have been made in any of the planning considerations?
Director?
Yeah, through you, Mr Mayor. As pointed out by the applicant, at the moment you've got a 20 metre wide road reserve, Bull Creek Road. And if you look at the setbacks of the development to the property boundaries of the properties on the northern side, there is quite a distance, quite a visual setback distance. In the R codes, the main focus of privacy and overlooking is on rear and side boundaries. Certainly when you face the street, you want to have windows and balconies overlooking the street to provide that passive surveillance. So certainly the expectation of the built form from Bull Creek Road would be that you would have windows and balconies, certainly for those first 3 levels. The treatment of the 4th storey, that'd be something that would certainly be part of the development application stage into the future. Obviously, that particular stage is part of stage 3. The development closer to the Leach Highways is the first stage, or the next stage of the plan. And as pointed out by the applicant before, staff were the ones that negotiated with the applicant and suggested an LDP rather than have incremental development applications over the site, given it's a large site. And I think from the community's perspective, having an LDP in place ensures that there's some transparency and everyone knows what the development will look like into the future. So, yeah, from a privacy perspective, all the planning documentation really just focuses on the side and rear boundaries and achieving that setback of 7.5 metres from a balcony and 15 metres where the buildings are 5 stories or more. So at 30 plus metres, it well and truly achieves the privacy requirements.
Thank you. Councillor Barry.
Just one other question then. I suppose given the fact that the city is the one that asked them for the LDP, would we then be encouraging the developer with the setbacks that they do have to plant more trees that at some stage or other would provide that better screening as opposed to, I think one of the gentlemen said, just council verge trees?
Director Bryan.
Thank you.
Through Mr Mayor, that's again, there's a clear intent in the LDP with a 4 metre vegetated buffer to have large trees on the south side. And certainly as part of a development application at the time that that particular development is proposed, we'd be seeking very detailed landscape plans, and the expectation would be that the trees would be mature from the start rather than small seedlings, because they would obviously take a long time to grow. So that's an issue that will be assessed as part of the development application for that particular stage. But the LDP at this stage does show a very clear intent to provide a detailed landscaping buffer between this development and the existing development.
Thank you. Councillors, any other questions? Councillor Sabiri.
Thank you. Just a question. When we get an LDP, isn't that when, before it goes to public comment, isn't it meant to come to council to have a look at it usually? I can't find this. I've been through. Yeah, thank you.
Director Bryan.
Through Mr Mayor. LDPs, most councils delegate the advertising of LDPs, and certainly we have a delegation to go out to advertising with an LDP. We've got an obligation to make sure the LDP has all the correct information on it. So as long as it's got, setbacks, heights, and it meets all those requirements, we're obliged to then advertise it to the community. And certainly council then has the say whether it finally adopts or refuses that particular LDP.
Thank you. Councillor Sabiri. Any further?
Yeah, no, that's it. My understanding was that it usually comes to us before it goes to public consultation. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Spencer Teo.
Director Bride mentioned it before that this particular one that seems to have some height issues is stage 3. What's the likely timing of the development of this stage?
Director Bride.
Through Mr Mayor. The stage 2, as I pointed out, along Leach Highway, or closer to the Webb Street Leach Highway intersection is the next stage. It's likely that stage 3, from what I understand, and obviously that would depend on market forces, but I understand it's around 5 years away.
Thank you. Councillor Spencer Teo.
And with an LDP, do the same principles apply in the sense that if we don't adopt or accept this, the applicant can then seek an overruling at SAT?
Director.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Yes, an LDP process is very much prescribed. So the city, if the city was next week, or council was to refuse or put a condition on which the applicant found to be not satisfactory to them, they can lodge an appeal through the SAT, the State Administrative Tribunal. If that was the case, and particularly if it was refused, if council was to defend that SAT appeal, we would need to then procure consultants, because staff have recommended support, and therefore we cannot appear in SAT in support of council's position if our opinion is that the LDP is sound.
Any further questions? Councillor Holland. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just a bit unclear. So we've got people here saying they've got real visual privacy concerns, and you're saying there is no visual privacy concerns. They've got that all adapted. Which one is it? We've got deputations here saying they're worried about it, and we've got people saying that there's nothing to be worried about.
Director, can you provide some clarity?
Yeah, as I said before, the state government has to draw a line somewhere on visual privacy. If it was a case of you could see something from a development on a second or third story, you'd probably have a 200-metre radius where you could actually visually see something. So the state planning documentation is trying to mitigate the main issues around privacy. It's very hard for the community to accept, but it's certainly the planning rationale is 7.5 metres from a balcony. Once you go above that, from a side and rear boundary, then you've deemed to have met the overlooking or privacy issues. As I said before, when the buildings are above 5 stories, you need to get a 12-metre separation between those particular structures. So, yes, there might be a concern around a visual aspect, but we're talking distances of 30, 40, 50 metres from where the development sits. So quite a significant setback from a visual perspective.
Thank you. Councillor Holland.
So just so I can get this right in my head, you're saying that all the stats and all the laws and all that have been abided by. So we can't, even though we've had deputations here worried about the visual aspects on it, we couldn't change it anyway if they've all been abided by whatever the local laws or planning laws or state government laws or whatever are there in the first place. If they say the visual aspect has got to be 30 metres and we've given 35, well then it sort of becomes moot, doesn't it?
Director, is that the point of view of the city?
Well,
Obviously, it's being recommended.
Yeah, through Mr Mayor. From our perspective, or from the planning legislation, the way it determines visual privacy would dictate that a sufficient separation has been achieved. So it'd be very difficult for council to utilise that as a reason to refuse the LDP, because if it did go to SAT, SAT would rely on that planning documentation, which would identify what the acceptable separation distances are. And given this proposed development would achieve that, it's unlikely to, I guess, get supported at a state administrative tribunal level.
Thank you. Any final questions before we move on? Councillor Bain.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Traffic impact assessment and traffic report are mentioned in the officer's report. Would it be possible to provide those for the OCM? Thank you.
Director Bride.
Yes, we'll attach that to the OCM report and make sure it's circulated.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor.
Just one question, thanks. For Director Bride, can you just quickly, maybe perhaps for the benefit of myself and some other councillors and maybe the gallery, what are some of the main grounds of objection for a council in this sort of situation? Thank you.
Director, are you able to answer that? I imagine there'd be a number.
Yeah, through Mr Mayor. Yes, certainly the intent of the LDP is to set some parameters around in which development can be considered. The current zoning applying to the site is quite obscure. It doesn't provide much detail besides general objectives. So the intention is to use the LDP to, I guess, set the framework. So really, the traffic issues have been looked at and addressed. So that's one area that we're required to consider as part of an LDP. The bulk and scale and how that has been arrived at. And obviously the applicant has provided a number of scaled models to show visually what it may look like, but of course it's not to the detail that you would find in the development application, which has got a very detailed facade treatment on it. So really it's probably bulk and scale, traffic are the two main issues. Overshadowing has already been pointed out given the location of the buildings and the fact that overshadowing would occur on the southern side. It's back into the side away from residents. So that'd be the main, I guess, issues.
Thank you. Councillor Kunza.
Through you, Mr Mayor, to Director Bride. I know other local governments have had issues with this. What would be the highest they are actually able to build on this site? Is there any controls with respect to how high these buildings can go?
Director Bride, how high can the building go?
Through Mr Mayor. The issue at the moment is there is very little guidance. So when the initial stage 1 development was prepared, the city had to make, I guess, its decision based on the bulk and scale, distance from residential areas, the positioning of where it was adjacent to Leach Highway. So at the moment, there's no limit, unlike a residential zone that's got an R coding, which has got certain height restrictions. This zoning hasn't got a specific height limit attached to it. So having an LDP and putting a framework in place gives everyone some transparency in looking at how the future development will proceed.
Councillor Kunza.
Not just in this instance, but in other sites across the city and across Perth. Whilst this is an agreement between the city and the relevant Adventist residential care, how would the relevant state government bodies determine what is appropriate in this instance? I mean, could they say 15, 20? Like, how do you determine what is appropriate? And given that the decision makers are a different body.
Director Bride.
Yeah, through Mr. Mayor. The JDAP would be the likely determining body for a future development application. Without an LDP in place, the question about how high, what's the appropriate scale, would be considered on a development application by development application basis. So there'd have to be some rationale that the applicant would need to go through. And that's probably the main reason that we recommended to the applicant was to come up with an LDP which shows a complete development plan over the site, setting those planning frameworks now.
Thank you. Councillor Kunz, anything else?
And given that this will be a process over many years, once the LDP is in place, can it be amended in the future, or is there any? Can they put in applications to JDAP in the future to go above what's agreed potentially this month?
Director.
Through Mr. Mayor, the JDAP would have to take into account the LDP adopted by council. When the JDAP makes a decision, they really become the council in that respect. So they would be not bound by it, but they'd have to show due regard to that plan. So anything that was well above the heights in that LDP would unlikely get approval unless there was a really strong justification as to why there should be a movement away from that plan.
Thank you. Anyone else before we move on? Thank you, councillors. We'll move on to item 7.1. Thanks to those in the public gallery that came along for that matter. Item 7.1, the officer responsible for this report is our interim CEO, Stephen Kane. The item is OC 004 of 21. The title of that report being Western Australian Local Government Association 2021 Annual General Meeting, City of Canning Voting Delegates. The recommendations on page 3 of the agenda and is also on screen. Does anyone have a question on that matter before we move on? Councillor Holland?
I think, didn't I read that someone had already nominated? Is that correct?
Yeah, I put my hand up. I've nominated, but I don't think anyone else has at this stage. CEO?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. No, we're looking for at least one other nomination, please.
And just in writing to the CEO would be the best way to go. Thank you very much. We'll move on.
Can I put my name up now if there's no one else that wants to do it?
Can you put it in writing and send it to the CEO?
I could, but I just wanted to check if... Oh, so that's for next week, right? Yeah, I get you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But yeah, just put it in writing, Deputy Mayor. I think that just so we're recorded.
I'm just wanting the council to be represented, but if anybody else wants to do it, okay. I'm happy for them to do it.
All right, I get it. All right, absolutely. Thank you. We'll move to 7.2, the responsible officer being Mr. Warren Bowe, the Acting Director of Canning Corporate and Commercial. It's item CC 036 of 21, the title of the report being a new lease for the Willetton Tennis Club, Burrendar Park. The recommendation is on page 8 of the agenda. Councillors, any questions on that matter before we move on? Councillor Kunza?
Just with respect to the netball club, is it just, do they only use the toilets? Do they use any other areas within the leased area?
Director Bowe?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm aware that they predominantly use the toilets, but the negotiations between the two clubs aims to enable them to access the leased area from time to time to take advantage of those facilities in there.
Councillor Kunza?
I was of the understanding that in these instances we look at, like I understand that we're looking at an agreement that sits under the lease between the two clubs, but that the city preferred to not give exclusive rights to one club. I know there's instances where certain clubs have built the facilities, which is why they get that special consideration, but is there a reason why they're preferencing the tennis club?
Director?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Predominantly because they were the original leaseholders of the original lease and do predominantly use the facility, but I can find some further information on that, Councillor Kunza, and provide that to all elected members.
Thank you. Any other questions before we move on? Councillor Spencer-Teo, and then I'll come to Councillor Ponaturai. Councillor Spencer-Teo.
I noticed that the proposed rent is in line with our scale 2. What were they paying up until this point?
Director Bo, do you know?
I don't know, Mr Mayor. I'll take that on notice.
Take that on notice, Councillor. Thank you. Councillor Ponaturai.
Between the, through you, Mr Mayor, to Director Bo, between the tennis club and netball club, I've been out and about in that area. I see most of the time, majority of the time, the tennis club playing there, but is Director Bo able to find out which club uses the space majority of the time?
Sorry, what was the question?
Which club uses the space majority of the time?
Most of the
space
time.
between the netball club and tennis club, yeah. They share the
that would
courts
be
as well.
part of, you're going to give a response, I think, to that earlier question and about the usage. Would that be involved in that? Would you be able to answer that question? Someone's got a microphone on, I think. Councillor Spencer-Teo, thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. No, I can answer that. The tennis club are the predominant user of the facility, and therefore we're negotiating
Secondary.
release with them.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks, councillors. If there's no other questions, we'll move on. Thank you. We now move to item CC 037 of 21, the title of the report being Late Item Monthly Financial Report for June 2021. The recommendation is on page 2 of the circulated late item, and it is also on the screen. Any questions on that matter, councillors? Councillor Holland, why are you smiling widely?
Because I knew where the hand would come from.
Councillor Barry?
Yes, just a few questions. Thanks, Mr Mayor. If we just go through, you can take them on notice as you wish. On page 6, staff costs were under budget by 410,000. I'd just like to know what the average is per annum of staff training, please. In D of the same page, utility charges were $320,000 over budget. The question I'd ask there is why was that, and are those extra charges identifiable as a breakdown, which may help in the future. The capital expenditure on the bottom, the city's annual budget went from 43.5 to 58 million with the inclusion of carry forward projects and other budget amendments. So that's an increase of $15 million. How much of that was carry forwards, I presume, from the year before? And what were the other budget amendments that made up that 15 million? And then I noticed that on the next page, page 7, the city's capital expenditure at the end of the month and the financial year was 29 million against that 58, which is just about half. I'm just wondering, I suppose, how did we spend that little? And if we did spend that amount, I mean, did we have a full complement of people working? Because it seems a little odd to me.
Okay.
On page 8, because the city has drawn down 10.5 of $19 million in loans. That was last year. And these were for either projects, capital expenditure projects that either didn't commence or were not completed by the end of the year. I'm just wondering whether we will, in turn, carry on with that extra $9 million loan drawdown. Non-operating grants, there's 10 out of 17 that we were supposed to get. I just wonder how, with a $7 million deficit, how we work that into a budget. Makes it hard for the officers, I'm sure. On page 11, it talks about budget preparation for surplus. City achieved surplus funds will lower the budget deficit on account of employee costs due to staff vacancies and any redundancies during the year when this amount will be transferred to the new employee entitlement reserve. The question is, where did it go before? on page 15, we've got a lot of positive variances. Now, my question, I suppose there's 29 plus 10. Now, I'm just wondering, these variances, do they have a cash value as we read it? And
Can you just want to keep going with your questions or come back to it? I mean, you've asked like 15 questions,
Right. So I suppose the question I asked then is if you've got all those cash, those variances, positive variances, do they have a cash value, and where would I find that amount of money? On page 23, in the reserve funding, now there was some redemptions from June 22nd. Now, the Bentley Regen had $3.6 million in it, and I no longer see that in this month's at all. So I'd like to know, where did that go? Golf course reserve had nearly $250,000. That is no longer a reserve fund, as noted. And the property surveillance, that is no longer there. So they were redemptions, but as I'm looking at the figures in front of me, they were not reinvested. The other question I have is basically the municipal fund for June, and that's probably only a couple of weeks ago, is only holding $3 million. So I'm just wondering, I mean, we seem to be sailing very close to the wind there. I mean, with our warrant listings for the month are generally at $12 million.
Your question?
It just, are we sailing close to the wind? It sort of sounds like we're getting close to trading insolvent.
Is that your final question?
I think so.
Thank
you.
I just make the point, Graham. While you were talking then, 4 members of staff here are trying to furiously keep up with you and try to write down all the questions that you're asking, most of which will need to be asked on notice. Now, you feel compelled to ask these at these meetings. I've got no issue with that, but it'd be so beneficial to staff here, even if you wrote them out yourself and then actually gave them a copy afterwards, so that we didn't have to have 4 members of staff, including the CEO and directors, sitting up here furiously trying to keep up with you while you speak. It would just be so beneficial if you could do that. It would really assist the meeting and the staff. Yeah, good.
Well, yes, I understand what you're saying, but by the same token, we have an audio which takes it down. Other than that...
But hang on that though, someone then needs to, in live time, listen 20 minutes, making notes, because we don't have software that actually transcribes this automatically. Somebody then has to sit down. So when you're talking about these things, and I know you're interested in costs and saving costs, there's a real cost to you not providing these questions in writing, because members of staff have to sit down and now rewrite them out, or as you said, listen to a 20-minute excerpt in the tape and then write them all out. So I'm just asking, would it be possible to come to some resolution where you can ask your questions, but can you please write them out so that at least staff don't have to then chase their tail on this?
Well, I think
you're not willing to do that?
No. The point is, I mean, if the questions were sent in and then they were written in to the next meeting and acknowledged, other than that, I mean, questions are what we're here for.
Absolutely, I've got no question with that. I just said to you, I don't have any issue with that.
No,
but there's real money being spent here from senior staff having to spend 20 minutes writing these out.
Like I said, it used to be in a previous council that any question that was asked was written down and the answer was given in the OCM. And similarly, if a question was asked during debate...
I'm not sure I'd be referencing the previous council as the vanguard for good governance, but nevertheless, I take your point.
I'm not saying it was, but I'll stick to the subject. That's what did happen.
Okay.
Other than that, and once again, I have to go back and point out the government guidelines said that if you do send in questions like that, you're actually cheating the ratepayers, because, I mean, they might want to know just what I was asking about,
but you can
answers to it.
But you can actually submit questions on notice, and then they actually become part of the written transcript. So when you're saying in a previous council they used to be recorded, they can be. If you actually submit them as questions on notice, they're recorded, as are the answers. Now-
maybe that's something we can look at when we're having a.
I'm just asking
a
for you
review
to
of the
come
standing
meet us
orders.
halfway on this, that's all. I'm not trying to be belligerent, I'm just saying that for the sake of the
I
council.
didn't say you were. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to make a fist of trying to answer some of those questions, councillor. And okay, CEO. And just for the sake, I'm going to refer to Mr. Kane as CEO. Interim CEO just sounds a little bit painstaking. We know he's the interim CEO, but I'll refer to him as CEO. CEO.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and I'll start, if it's all right, Councillor Barry, and I'll throw to the newly appointed Finance Director. If we start from the end and work our way backwards, the city has sufficient municipal funding to ensure its operation can continue throughout the period of June until the first of the rate receipts are received here. So I'm not worried about a cash flow shortfall at this point in time. If I come back to your query on page 23 in terms of the drawdown, so what you see there are the values of amounts we have in investments in reserve. So where we have now started to use those reserve funds, for instance, last month council approved the golf course project. We need to take that money out of reserve to add to the loan fund to better use for the capital works. So we take that money out of reserve and we hold it back in the municipal fund until it's ready to go out. So things like a property surveillance reserve, where we have used the last of it. As you're aware, when we adopted the budget, it had a small deficit in the property surveillance reserve. So we've closed those values out in your reserve funding in order to draw them into municipal fund in order to better use the fund to general operations. I'm presuming in this case, in regard to Bentley Regen, we've used that to fund one of the capital projects, but I'll ask Mr Director Bowe to deal with that.
Director Bowe.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. The Bentley Regeneration Reserve was used to purchase and fund the development of the Intercultural Centre on Hillview Place, and notionally the money that was put aside for the further parkland development as part of the Bentley Parkscapes projects will be funded through borrowings moving forward.
I'll come back, Mr Mayor.
CEO.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. In terms of the issues to do with your budget variances, where we look at on page 15 a series of budget variances, each of those variances aggregate back into the categories shown under nature and type. So if we look at a large number of those individual variances, you'll see them consolidated into the statement that's on page 13. So they are real cash variances for us. They come back into an aggregated position. It's not a case of got lots of little different cash balances, but they will sit there in the terms of the nature and type reporting. In terms of the query on the budget for employee entitlements reserves, this reserve was not created last financial year. Therefore, any time we had a requirement to accrue these long-term benefit staff, we had no reserve in order to be able to accrue those costs into it. So all we could do is basically take that back and accrue it back into municipal operation. You're aware in the municipal operation, though, it was running a significant deficit, so there was no additional money to be put aside. So this year we are attempting, where the staff employee costs are showing as being under budget, we would normally at that end of June do all of the allocations and accruals for their leave, their long service leave. Because we have a reserve, if there is a surplus of funds specifically in employee entitlements, we'll transfer it into that reserve to meet a future cash need for the employee entitlement. The key for us, though, is we will only do a cash transfer if there is surplus funds in excess of what Council's adopted budget position was. If there is no surplus funds to compare the adopted budget position, we will not be able to transfer. Non-operating grants. The timing of non-operating grants is such that we will only receive acquittal of those grants when we have completed projects. I signed off, again in my role as CEO, a whole series of acquittals just the other day for a large number of road projects which were completed at the end of June. We won't receive the cash for that until sometime probably July or maybe August. From a cash flow perspective, which is what you see there, you see a non-operating grant budget of $17 million, of which we've received $10 million today. So there's still another $7 million non-operating grants yet to be received. But part of those non-operating grants could include the LRCI projects. Right at the end of the financial year, the federal government granted us another $3 million of capital projects for LRCI. In regard to the graph which you spoke about earlier on, where we suddenly go from the last month up to $58 million worth of capital budget, that includes things like the LRCI. So we won't be able to acquit those grants until we've delivered the projects. They'll be sometime in the current financial year, but the cash will eventually be received by the city. In terms of loan drawdowns, yes, we will need to draw down loans at a future time. It's always a case of timing for loan drawdown. We executed a significant loan drawdown of about, from memory, about $11 million in the last week of June. And we did that because we were running short of cash at that bit of time. From the earlier descriptions, I brought you a couple of months ago a graph which showed the movement of cash in out of the organisation and said we would defer those loan drawdowns until the point where we actually needed it. So finally in June we needed to draw down our loans, but we didn't need to draw them all. So unless we complete the capital works or we have a requirement for the cash, we won't draw down on a loan until it's required. The capital works is an interesting beast. If you look at the chart on page 7, you will see that from a cash perspective, we had by the end of June spent just under $30 million on capital works. We had initiated another commitment, that's works we had already started, of another $10 million worth of capital works for which we had not yet had to pay the bill. So of the total allocation, then about $40 million against what became a budget in the end of $58 million. Now bear in mind that $58 million included $3 million given to us in the last couple of weeks of the term. So there was absolutely no capacity for the city to spend that $3 million. When council adopted its budget last year, it did so with a fairly aggressive capital works program. It did so with a works program that frankly just could not be achieved in the 12-month program. So whilst the budget showed a notional distribution of that cash, it was not possible for the city staff to complete a program. Even that with that said, 82% of all capital works were initiated in the year. And I believe from what Director Bowes told me, that's a record for delivery. We are going to have a workshop internally in the staff. It's something I've asked for to look at what are the roadblocks now to us going beyond the 40 million. So if council in future years says, well, yes, we're going to start to reinvest some of these funds back into the community facilities, are the things happening now that are stopping us with an internal process going beyond a threshold? It would be normal for a council of this size to carry forward somewhere at least $10 million of capital works into a new year. I'm aware that larger councils might be carrying $30 or $40 million of capital works into a new year. Where you get projects like the LRCI for $3 million physically, they can't be spent. I hope that answers some of the questions you've asked tonight. We will come back to you on the issues around the average staff training costs. We'll come back to the issues on the detail and the breakdown of the utility costs. And I think that's the list I had here. Director Bowe, did you have anything else?
Director Bowe.
If I could, thank you, Mr Mayor. I do refer Councillor Barry to my email of the 20th of May where I spoke about the quantum of the capital budget this year, which also included $15 million worth of brought forward projects, which was in direct response to the COVID-19 pandemic and was at the request of council. Director Kane has covered off on a number of the points that I had to respond. Other than that, the administration is incredibly proud of its record of delivering capital projects this year. Notwithstanding, there are a number of projects which have covered the 2 financial years. They include the Hillview Intercultural Building, the Kent Street Weir project, Chapman and Ashburn upgrade, the Lake Street Urban Stream, the Whaleback Golf Course Irrigation Project, the LRCI funded projects, the Coker Park Lighting Project, the Burrendar Park, Burrendar Boulevard upgrade project. So there's a significant number of projects that are either in train or will soon be finished in this current now financial year, and to in effect deliver $40 million worth of capital projects when our previous capital budget was around the 28 to 32 million, and we struggled to deliver that in the previous 3 years of my tenure here at the city. I can safely say that we have delivered a significant amount of work for the community in direct response to the council resolution to bring forward $15 million of projects.
Thank you. Councillor Ponaturo, you had a question you'd like to ask?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just quickly on the, let me just get, because I got two financial reports, okay. Under the statement of comprehensive income by nature and type for the period 30th June, there is a line item, transfers from reserves, in bracket restricted assets, 21 million. So I just want to know what are the restricted assets that transfers of 21 million, and that's 21 million variance, yeah.
Director Bowe?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm happy to take that question on notice.
Take that on notice. Thanks,
Okay.
Councillor
And
Ponaturo.
just one more quick question.
Yeah, of course.
I think I've emailed earlier to CEO Stephen and to Director Warren Bowe, because we adopted the option 2 as a rating statement as part of the budget on the 24th of June. Can we use that as a baseline and reporting so that we know where we're going to travel to get to 23, 24 to the break even? Because I have a dream that that's when we'll get there. So can we have a report? I'm sure May is killing the cockroach or something.
I'm having a David Attenborough moment up here, but yes, I did have something crawling across my desk. Director Bowe, we don't want to squash Councillor Ponaturo's dreams.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Received the email from Councillor Ponaturo in addition to the brief conversation I had with her yesterday on this, and the executive and I will look to see if we can develop a report that meets your needs in relation to the statement of comprehensive income. I think it was
Councillor Ponaturo.
I'll appreciate this without much time taking. I'm sure finance one, with that able to give you dashboard report or something, or if finance one can produce, that'll be much better than putting
Yeah,
so much
definitely.
timing.
Looking at it. Yeah, terrific. Thank you very much. Councillor Barry.
Two, sorry. So I'm assuming now that the Hillview is taking up the bulk, if not all, of the 3.6 million for the Bentley
You're
region.
directing the question through me to...
Through you to
Yeah, Director
whoever
Bowe.
wants to answer it.
Yes, that's correct, Councillor Barry, and there's some funding remaining for Chapman Ashburton.
The funding is remaining for Chapman.
Councillor Barry.
Yes.
Yeah, and the Wyong one is going to be a loan.
Correct.
Okay, and the last question is, and I went and had a look on the website today, when will we get a detailed budget for the 21-22 up on the website?
Director Bowe, any idea? We take that on
I'll
notice?
find out, Mr. Mayor.
You'll find out. We'll take that on notice. Thank you. Councillor Bain.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I refer to page 20, and I believe it will be a question most appropriately responded to by Director Bride. So Southern Link Road Stage 3, it is mentioned that the land purchase will need to be assessed by Western Power. What will Western Power be assessing? Thank you.
Director Bride, are you able to answer that?
Through Mr. Mayor, certainly the land is owned by Western Power at the moment, so any decision or any offer, which obviously need to come to council for endorsement, would be subject to Western Power's consideration.
Thank you. Thanks, councillors. We'll move on to item 7.3. Mr. Graham Bride is the Director of Canning Development and the responsible officer for the following reports. CD 019 of 21, the report title being Adoption of Scheme Amendment number 2 to Local Planning Scheme number 42. The recommendation is on page 17 and is also on screen. Any questions on that one, councillors, before we move on? Thank you. We'll move on now. We've already moved past CD 02021 that was brought forward earlier. CD 021 of 21 is the review of Dog Local Law 2021 by the Joint Standing Committee on Delegated Legislation. That recommendation is on page 52 of tonight's agenda and is on the screen. Does anyone have a question in relation to the Dog Local Law? No? Thank you. We'll move on to EN 012 of 21. Mr. Ashley McKinnon, the Acting Director of Canning Environment, is a responsible officer. The report being request 15/2/2019 for pre-qualified panel suppliers for building construction and renewal works. The recommendation being on page 57. Any questions on that item? Councillor Barry, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick one. It's says of the 2017-2020, the category 1 and 2 were 100,000 to 500, and I see now it's jumped up to 750. Is there a reason why? Thank you.
Mr McKinnon?
Councillor Barry, it was deemed advantageous to have a panel split between smaller works and larger works, and builders typically differ between the two sizes of building works, and it aids efficiency of the process to have a larger panel comprised of two sets of works of differing quantum.
Thank you.
So the other question is that how do I get around this? It's confidential. The sum of money, which is in the confidential side, I would assume there wouldn't be too many over the 750 anyway. Would that be a fair assumption?
Have you got any idea what Councillor Barry's talking about? You're looking puzzled. Did you want to ask that question by email if you're having problems with confidentiality?
Otherwise I'll breach confidentiality.
You okay with that? Okay. Councillor Ponaturo?
Just to
Councillor Ponaturo?
Yeah, thank you. On this tenders and construction company, a general question. How many of these businesses are based in Canning or?
That's in the report.
No, how many of, yeah.
Councillor Penrith, there are two tenderers who are based in Canning.
Yeah. And how are we encouraging more people to be coming into our small business, getting into our books? It's maybe not related to this, but generally I'm asking the question. Thank you.
I'll allow
Director,
allow Director McQuaid to answer about business development.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. The business development team and the procurement team are actually currently working up a plan that we will send through to Council for your consideration in relation to our procurement policy obviously has a buy local first pro forma, so how do we better utilise that internally with our staff? And then the secondary part where the business development team are focused is how do we promote and work with small businesses so that they know how to navigate the city's systems and processes. So we're just developing a plan for that, and then we'll be starting to roll that out and focusing on getting that word out to local businesses and working with them.
Oh, that's good news. So it's happening here. Yep, thank you. Any other questions, councillors, before we move on? Thank you. We'll move on to EN 013 of 21, the report being Shelley East Retrospective Undergrounding Project. The recommendation is on page 71 of the agenda and is on the screens. I'm pleased to see that the cost has come down considerably, which is a terrific outcome for residents. But councillors, do we have any questions? Councillor Kunza.
Just a couple of questions, Mr Mayor, through you. Following on your comment on cost, whilst it's great to see it go down, how transparent are Western Power in that with the cost structure? Because when we first looked at the State Underground Power Project, Shelley East was supposed to be around 4,150, but that was at 50%. When we looked at the RUP, my understanding was we were supposed to cover 100%, and then there was a 13.9% addition onto that for Western Power overheads. And then it was supposed to come into $7,500. Now it's come down to $6,000. And I was just wondering, it just seems to be all over the place. And that's great, given that the RUP's 100%. But how transparent are Western Power with these estimates? And I know
Mr. McKinnon.
Councillor Kunze, within the limits of their commercial confidentiality, they do go to that level that you've mentioned, and they've talked about the synergies from combining the two projects sequentially. But I will actually pass to Anna Scantlebury, our officer in charge of Shelley East, and she can provide some more detail for you.
We're not breaching confidentiality by talking about that? Is that something that might want to be provided to council under separate
Ms Scantlebury is not going to talk about anything that's commercial and confidential.
Ms Scantlebury, thank you.
Oh, good afternoon, councils. But the price has come down so much, one from the synergies between the two projects, so you're moving directly from one to the other. We've got some cost savings there, but that 13.9% that you did mention, that was a Western Power decision because of the way that they're going forward, and because it is a mainly residential area, that they're not going to apply that. So that was a significant saving there, but they definitely put a lot of effort into reducing the price for us over that time.
Good outcome. Councillor Kunze.
Yeah, and just to follow up, I don't know if the state government is intending to do another state underground power project, but do we actually communicate with them? I mean, it was a bit ridiculous that in 2016 they were looking at 500 to 850 lots, and we said that Shelley should be done as one suburb, and then we subsequently get to the point where there's synergies between the projects and we need to do a RUP. Is there feedback provided to the state government that they should have just made a bigger project to begin with and that we shouldn't be doing two separate projects here? It just seems quite ludicrous that we're now talking about the synergies between the two projects.
Do we generally poke the bear, Mr McKinnon?
It's generally advisable not to, but diplomatically perhaps. No, we haven't raised it within our current structured discussions with Western Power. It's not within the ambit of our level to do so. And ultimately, they are moving away from sub-projects, and they've indicated that they were moving to the NRUP model, where it's based on the end of life of their networks, which may span more than one council area. And that's their go forward.
I guess the good thing is that it was suggested pretty much by us, and they did listen, and it has been done, so it's a good outcome. You know, I guess everyone's learning from the process. Any other questions on this item before we move on, councillors? Thank you. We'll move on to the next item then. The responsible officer being, Dr McQuaid to my left, to your right. There are no reports for her directorate. We have notice of motion for consideration at the next ordinary council meeting. There is one here from Councillor Spencer Teo. It's notice of motion 006 of 21, the title being policy loan funding. The recommendation is on page 81 of the agenda and is also on screen. Councillors, any questions on that matter before we close for the evening? Councillor Bain? I'd like to close. Councillor Bain.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So obviously a 10-year loan was recently requested by the WBA. Should such a policy be in place, what would be the city's response to a community group applying for a 6, 7, 8, 9-year loan? Thank you.
Director?
I don't think we would have a response at that particular time, Mr Mayor. I think we would need to consider the duration of any request for loan funds from community groups on their merits. Obviously, Councillor Spencer Teo's notice of motion indicates a period of up to 5 years. I think when we provide the response back to council, if the notice of motion is supported, we would do a review and investigate some of the other potential terms and quantums of loan funding that may be provided after a policy is endorsed by council. At the moment, the only reference point that we have, or the most recent reference points in relation to loan funding, is the Corinthian Park Tennis Club and the Willetton Basketball Association, both significantly different in their durations. So we would need to give that some consideration and ultimately be a council decision. Councillor Bain.
Thank you, Director. Thank you, Councillor Bain. Thank you, councillors. If there are no further questions, we'll move on to urgent business at item 9. There is none this evening. Confidential matters. Thanks, Sean, for coming along. Council will now consider confidential matters. I thank members of the public for their attendance tonight and ask that they please leave the chamber in order for council to consider the confidential matters. And Sean, I hope you've got an umbrella. You have. Well done. Council, just pause for a moment while staff close the door.
Okay. Rolling along.